I'm very excited now to bring out some of these policymakers that fellows like ours are trying to influence to talk about blue ribbon commissions that have been developed and how we can actually move action forward out of that in cyberspace. So I'd like to introduce our panel as they come out. So first we have Peter Altabef, who is the chairman, president, and CEO of Unisys, but also is deeply involved in the Cyber Moonshot Initiative. Second, we have Kiersten Todt, who was with the Presidential Commission on Enhancing National Cybersecurity. And finally, it's nice to meet you, Admiral. I have Admiral Mark Montgomery, who is the Executive Director of the U.S. Cyberspace Solarium Commission. So thank you all for being here. So first, let's start with Peter. Tell us about the Cyber Moonshot Initiative. What is it, what are you doing, and where is it expected to go?
So the Cyber Moonshot Initiative is a product of the NSTAC, which is the National Security Telecommunications Advisory Council, one of two presidential councils dealing with national security, the internet. The effort was launched about 2 years ago and resulted in a paper that was submitted to the White House last November, which is called the Cybersecurity Moonshot. It was followed up last month with a paper that is a subset of that, specifically on supply chain 5G. And we took a different tact. There are a lot of cybersecurity projects out there, and the tact that we took at the request of the White House, DHS, and the NSA was to look broader. So we actually looked out on a 10-year horizon, and the goal of the project is to create a safe and secure internet for government and critical services by 2028. And when you do that, and you're not worried about fixing a zero-day problem, you're not worried about how you deal with ransomware tomorrow, and you go out 10 years, the tools you have, the weapons you can use are dramatically different. So while technology, and whether it's something that is present today like AI or something like quantum, which is on the horizon, was absolutely part of our calculus, technology was only 1/6 of the analysis we did. We looked at 6 pillars. Because when you go out over an extended period of time, all of a sudden you can use things that you can't do in a week or a month or a year. So we went very deeply into things like education. How do we reform education, both to get more education of good cyber hygiene, as well as to get a better educated populace so that we can actually devote more resources to cyber. We looked at behavior, human behavior. How do we actually get people to do the things that they need to do to create a safer and more secure internet? We looked at policy, what laws and what regulations would have to change, but we looked at privacy. And we focused very much on what you could do from a sense of accountability for some transactions where you need authentication, and how you can make sure that on transactions that don't have to be authenticated, you could respect privacy in a more robust way than we have today. We looked at the ecosystem, all of this. How does it all work together? And so when we took these 6 items, we actually had a much broader, if you will, portfolio to deal with. And that is where we have come and where we're continuing to go.
Fantastic. Well, so now I want to turn to Mark. I'd love to hear more about the Solarium and how you are actually pulling it all together. So tell us what's going on in your space.
Sure, thanks. So ours is a little different than the NSTAC in the sense that it's a one-year event. It's a one-year commission established by the last year's National Defense Authorization Act. And what we're doing is we've been asked to take a look at what's the proper strategic approach to defend our critical infrastructure against a cyber event of significant consequence. And really what that means is recommend a strategic approach and the attendant policy recommendations that would, or policy actions that would enhance or enable the strategic approach you recommend. And very specifically, because we have, and we'll talk about this later, I think, legislators on our commission, it means coming up with legislative proposals. So I think we have a mix of the strategic thinking that Peter's referred to, and I think more of the tactical and operational thinking that you traditionally see in a commission.
Fantastic. And Kiersten, I saved you for last because you actually got to wrap up and might have some lessons to draw from. So tell us about the Presidential Commission on Enhancing National Cybersecurity. What was it seeking to accomplish, and what challenges did you face in doing it?
Thank you, Betsy. I do feel like we're sort of the Commission Christmas Carol, the ghosts of Christmas past, present, and future, although we still have present and future going. We did wrap it up, which I continue to hold this around so that it's a documentation of something that was achieved, but certainly not something that was intended to stay on the shelf. Our mission, what President Obama identified, it was started for two reasons. The first was in response to the Office of Personnel Management breach. And what the impact of that was when that happened, President Obama didn't know who he had on staff to truly turn to in cybersecurity. Certainly Lisa Monaco, Aspen's own, who was a tremendous advocate throughout the process, was the person for whom this was a part of her portfolio. But what he recognized was this issue was so broad that the government at that point wasn't organized effectively to address cybersecurity. The second piece of this really looked at what President Obama didn't want the incoming administration to face, which was what he confronted, and he thought he didn't have enough time to get up to speed on cyber, that there's so much that's happening in this space that whomever was coming in the new administration, he wanted to create a roadmap for the incoming administration. So this commission was bipartisan, it was independent, and the intention was primarily to create this roadmap. And we were asked to look at 8 issues, including research and development, the Internet of Things, critical infrastructure, education, small and medium-sized businesses, state and local governments, and the organization of federal government. And so what we did is over the course of 9 months, the executive order was launched in February. The commission really got underway in March. We had our first meeting in April, and the report was due to the president on December 1st. We convened 6 meetings over the course of the year that focused on these key issues to really get from the sectors, from industry, from government as well, what the key issues were, not just the solutions, but where the problems were. And so we set out to produce a report that would be actionable with recommendations and action items. And our intent was to then take this report and brief the transition team, which we then had the opportunity to do. And we did have some good fortune, I think, in our process, because while that was the ultimate goal, was to be able to brief the transition team, one of the key pieces of our success was the fact that some of the Obama individuals and the National Security Council staff stayed through the transition for the Trump administration and worked very closely with the Trump White House on the development of the Cybersecurity Executive Order, which was released in May of 2017. And that was very valuable, because what that meant was if there was the underground version of the first executive order, which really was exactly what President Obama was hoping wouldn't happen, which was just sort of a restart. And what President Trump's administration did, focused on cybersecurity, and the holdovers from the Obama administration did, is they ensured that that EO actually brought us and level set from where we were currently. And now one of the other elements that we really focused on as far as how to keep this alive was we engaged our commissioners post-commission to take on some of these efforts and to continue to work on them. And so I'll highlight one, which was in workforce. Ajay Banga, who is a commissioner and the CEO of MasterCard, developed an initiative during the commission for workforce, which he actually just launched this year, which involves giving financial aid to students who work in government, in the federal government, and then come to work for MasterCard. And just finally, in summary, the other key element to the follow-on was, as we were wrapping up, the vice chair of the commission, Sam Palmisano, the retired CEO of IBM, and Ajay Banga, the CEO of MasterCard, and myself got together to say, how do we keep this momentum? And in collaboration with Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, and Penny Pritzker, who was the Secretary of Commerce at the time, we launched a nonprofit in 2017 that looked at how do you provide free tools and resources for small businesses, and that's called the Cyber Readiness Institute, and I run that now with them. The idea here is that we're going to keep the momentum of what are the key issues that we need to address in order to move forward, because as we've all talked about and we all understand, the evolution of this doesn't stop, and that's why there is the moonshot, that's why there is the Solarium, and they all need to work off of each other.
Fantastic. Well, So it sounds like a lot of positive momentum, but we want to push hard here and ask about the challenges. There have been a number of blue ribbon commissions in this space. Cybersecurity is replete with them. What do you see as the biggest challenges to accomplishing your goals? Any of you, please.
I guess I'll take the...
You look like you're ready.
I'll take the first on that one. Well, I think it's interesting in talking about these three efforts. All of these efforts are apolitical, right? Mm-hmm. So NSTAC was formed in 1982 and is the longest standing presidential commission of its type and has members who have been nominated by various presidents over time. Obviously, these other two elements, are both, from all specters of politics. So I think there's an agreement among all of us that cyber is not a political issue, full stop. Mm-hmm. That actually is a truism. It's also occasionally a hindrance because you have to deal with people who believe in cyber but also come from the environments that they have. Mm-hmm. So in our case, the NSTAC proposal actually has three levels. So the first level is an organizational level that says this really needs to be a whole of nation effort, but the whole of nation effort ought to be guided by the government, and actually calls for a governmental-led commission made up of academia, as well as business, as well as private citizens, and the government. Then it has the 6 pillars, and then it has grand challenges to kind of get these things moving quicker. We have not yet had a launch at the top level of that governmental body that would launch this, almost akin to a NASA launch. Now, in the case of the original moonshot, NASA already existed, but it was just a tiny figment of what it ultimately became. So I think there is a need in all of these. Obviously, you have Congress involved, which we did not have the benefit of. This was more at the administration and agency level. But I think that there is a need to say not only is there an issue that the issue goes beyond politics, but there's an urgency in the issue. And I think we just have to keep working it. We've had workshops since last November. We're going to have another workshop in November on this. There's a huge groundswell of support, and it's really a question of when do we kind of move the ball so that it finally gets momentum. And I think that's true of all of these efforts. Solarium is the newest, so you're still not yet ready to launch, but we hope once you launch, you get that momentum.
So what's the biggest challenge? I think for us, it's been, I'll stipulate everything Peter said, but then I'd add for us that the biggest challenge is that as we look at the critical infrastructure that our national security system relies on, it's said, and I think it's probably true, that 85% is owned and operated by the private sector. Only a small percentage of that has the proper level of cybersecurity investment, personnel, and kind of life cycle management, procuring of systems, hiring of the right people, using the right procedures. And a lot of the companies, the large majority of the companies where, and these can be small, medium, and large, that are not making that appropriate cybersecurity investment, which, kind of a good estimate would be 8 to 10 to 12% of your overall IT budget being cybersecurity. And the companies that aren't doing that, it's a failure to recognize the threat. Maybe they're not as susceptible to criminal behavior. Maybe they don't see the nation-state problem that we describe that's described generally by all three of our commissions. And to me, this lingering lack of recognition of the problem is really is a significant challenge. And so any recommendation we have runs into a cost-benefit of analysis at that company and where the decision's made not to make the cybersecurity investment. So to me, I think that's probably has been and will remain for some time the biggest challenge we face.
Fantastic. Kiersten?
I think there are two ways to look at it. There's the operational, and I think just that gets very much in the weeds, but it's very difficult to staff one of these things with detailees. When you're looking across the board, I think, as Peter said, I agree that some of the pluses can be the minuses. I think it's great for Mark that he's got the legislative power behind him. At the same time, you have agendas, right? And so I didn't have anybody who was active within government on the commission, which meant I didn't really have a lot of impact per se within government, but then you have independent agendas that are trying to work toward the greater good. So you're always trying to balance these. But to build off of what Mark said, which I think is really important in this day and age, is that the environment and the threat is evolving so quickly. And so one example that we had was we were given critical infrastructure as an issue to address. And the real debate that the commission had was, well, how we define critical infrastructure has changed so much. And that wasn't really something we could take on in 9 months. And so we talked a lot about the interdependencies. We talked a lot about the fact that cyber is the only domain where we ask companies to defend themselves. And how does this all work? So I think that dynamic nature, particularly for this issue, makes it challenging because you do want to address the broader issues, but as Peter talked about with the moonshot, you've got to break it into these actionable pieces, which is what the grand challenges are, and I think a very effective tool in how to do so.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for being honest about the challenges. Let's talk about how you actually get things done. So what are you thinking about, either in the past, present, or future? I do love the Christmas Carol analogy here, about how to actually accomplish next steps. We just had a bunch of fellows present really practical outputs. What are you thinking about in terms of practicalities to make sure that people actually take your ideas and put them forward? Do you want to start with that one, Mark?
Sure, I'll go ahead. As Kiersten said, one of the advantages we have is legislators. So I have 4 commissioners who are legislators. That means they have a natural inclination to seek solutions, remedy through the law. So as we develop our strategic approach and the attendant policy recommendations, some percentage of them will be seen as things that there's a consensus on, and for which the legislative members say, we could probably get that done politically. So those will be rapidly transitioned into legislative proposals that we'll submit to attempt to get into law in the next available opportunity. And there's a couple good vehicles for doing that. In addition, we'll develop on the things that we think, hey, these are the commissioners think these are important. We can get a consensus that we agree on it, but they just politically are not viable at this moment. The sense, either in the Congress or in the country that this is too much. Those proposals we'll try to get to a similar level of detail, but really have on the shelf, so that when there's a significant cyber event and they turn, the leadership in the White House and the executive branch and in the legislative branch are looking for the right solution, it's kind of suitcased, ready to go on the shelf. And obviously, they'll have to be amended slightly for the conditions that exist at the time. So, our 2 efforts there are what we can get done now and what we'll have ready when the sense of angst or the sense of shared risk is such that more can be introduced. So I think relying on our legislators to do that will really drive us to success.
That's fantastic, and I love your way of thinking about ideas that might not be ready yet, but having something ready to go. I think that's a really important nuance to take away. Kiersten, you're sort of still in the process of trying to push things forward. How is the cyber readiness work going, and what are you thinking about in terms of practicalities there?
So I think, it's great when we had the momentum of the commissioners to say and to invest in something that was bigger than any individual. And so as we concluded the commission and we're looking at what to do next, there is still a communication among all the commissioners around how do we continue to move the ball forward on these recommendations, and more importantly, how do we take these actions into our businesses, our universities, our companies to do so. But the Cyber Readiness Institute, I think, has created this momentum specifically focused on small and medium-sized businesses, which has become more and more relevant as we focus on 2 key elements to cyber solutions: human behavior as the core to cyber elements, and then supply chain security. Bruce he was over there a moment ago, but he had a great op-ed, I think it was last week in the New York Times, that talked about every element of the supply chain is vulnerable. And that's really one of the pieces that we now see in the broader scope. So taking the flag of the recommendations and not seeing them as the bookend, but actually seeing them as the building block upon what comes next. And I think the commissioners that we were very fortunate that each of them has taken it on in their own unique ways, but continue to work together as a group to be able to execute and make actionable the recommendations that we discussed.
That's fantastic. Peter?
Yeah, I would add that, so, each of these are living efforts. So although the organizational recommendations have not yet been adopted, but may if there's a Sputnik moment for us, the process adoptions and the recommendations are being worked through. So CISA, and you guys heard from Deputy Director earlier today, is actively using some of the recommendations that we made, as are other agencies of the government. So these do have impacts, even if they are at first indirect, but they do have impacts. And it's interesting, our effort is 100% defensive. So our effort is, unlike Solarium, which both has an offensive and a defensive component, ours is always, how do we protect the internet? How do we protect the commercial engine and the people who rely on the internet, which is pretty much the whole country? But as you work through the effort here and you gather support, one of the organizations that has been hugely supportive of our effort is the Armed Forces Service Academies. And in fact, the first two Grand Challenges meetings we've had have been at Annapolis and Colorado Springs. And that's because there's this deep understanding among the service academies and the defense organization that one of the ways you enhance their ability to do their job is for us to have a stronger national defense on these. And so they have to do less. So, you know, whether you're looking at this from an offensive or a defensive point of view, you quickly realize that, you know, there are mutual benefits to everybody aligning by this. And I think all three of us have had that experience and will continue to.
Well, so just before you came on, we had our fellows actually giving ideas of their demos and things they've built. So I'd love to hear from you. Imagine that we had fellows that we were able to second to you, people who could build stuff, help you do practical things. What practical thing would you love to do next that you haven't had the chance to do yet?
I'll start because I think today's been hugely satisfying as a participant, because so many of the panels today have been self-reinforcing. So the Aspen Institute's effort around internet protocols and is a huge positive step, right? One of the questions is, if you want to get a more safe, secure internet, how do you do the basic tackling of making sure there's accountability among the internet service providers? So that discussion, I thought, was hugely valuable, as was Lisa Monaco's discussion about R&D spending in the United States, right? So the government's portion of fundamental R&D is at its low point in decades and decades. And one of the things we saw as we did our review is that is not really sustainable. It's not really sustainable when you look at what's happening elsewhere in the world. And, you know, the retort seems to be to rely on companies, wonderful companies, some of whom are represented in this room. But as a country, do we really want to rely on companies to do all of the research and development? And their interests, while good-natured and good-spirited, aren't necessarily always aligned with a broad adoption by the country. So I think a lot of what we heard today, really throughout the day, has been reinforcing, I think, about all three of our projects.
Great. Practical idea for somebody to take on?
Yeah, I'd like to break it out into three components. I think the first, which is just very direct because it hits on so many of the issues that we've talked about, is stronger authentication. Coming up with a solution for stronger authentication. You know, we had, as I mentioned, some resources with MIT, some others that were supporting the commission, and we continue to hear the technology and the innovation that's out there. But coming up with an ability to create stronger authentication across the board, given that password is the greatest, password breaches, vulnerabilities, the greatest access point to networks, all the statistics that everybody in this room knows about. But really, if you're going to innovate and you're looking to figure that out, understanding what is out there and how we're going to funnel that into truly stronger authentication for the future. The second piece is we have focused so much on technology, and we have focused so much on what can be produced that we have lost a little bit of the focus, lost a lot perhaps, on human behavior. As we look into the future, one of the issues that the commission really grappled with was the reconciliation of moving security away from the end user and educating the end user, and then recognizing that there's actually the hybrid approach. But more and more we understand that the foundation for security is human behavior. So when we're thinking about how to innovate, we go immediately to technology, but I believe we need to think how to innovate around human behavior that is much more effective. And the third and final piece, which goes a little bit outside, Betsy, of what you're asking, but I think as we're looking into the future is important, and to Peter's point, it builds off of a lot of what's been said today, which is how industry and government work together in this space is going to become more and more critical. I actually push back a little bit on a comment that was made 2 panels ago, which is, I think that the technology sector knows what their responsibility is, and they're doing a good job. Well, I would say no. I would say that the technology sector may know what their responsibility is, but we're not doing a good job coming together to understand where actually the solutions lie. They're not going to lie in industry. They're not going to lie in government. They're going to be put together. And something that Peter said around, having industry innovate, which is, I read an article, it was recently, it's great that we have industry investing in utilities, in space exploration, but we have NASA. We have this investment from our government in these elements, and we kind of have to recalibrate right now on what that balance is, because I think it's getting a little bit out of control and a little bit away from the right balance and the right management.
One point before I move on, I think your point about passwords is incredibly important, and I think it's not said enough that if quantum computing lives up to its potential, the ideas of our basic encryption systems that we use today will be essentially no longer applicable. So it's going to be a moment at which it tips over, and let's hope that some of the good people in this room are working on that problem. But so, Mark, I don't want to forget you. What sort of practical help would you wish people were working on right now?
So because we're going on, I'll probably just refer to things our commissioners have already talked about. I think Samantha Ravitch, one of our commissioners, has talked a lot about how we think about continuity of the economy, which is the idea we really do have to start to get our head around how we restore the economy after a significant event. We think a lot about what are called COOP and COG, or continuity of the presidency, continuity of the government. It's more than just designated survivor. There's a whole ligature of DOD and other federal agency support to keep that. But we don't think as much about continuity of the economy. How do you restore rapidly large sectors of the electrical power grid to restore financial services in the event of a large-scale cyber incident, either accidental or intentional? That occurs. So I think we're starting to try to get our hands around that, but thinking about how you do continuity of the economy and provide that, and how you exercise it and use it so that there's a sense of partnership between the private sector and the federal government as you begin to restore yourself after a major calamity. If I could give one other one that we've heard from some of our commissioners is the idea of how do you scale cyber education program. So the government runs something called CyberCore Scholarship for Service, which has probably put about 3,000 undergraduates through college in a cybersecurity curriculum in exchange for service, between 2 and 4 years of federal service. Many of those students have gone on to do full-time careers now, are committed or have gone long enough that they can do full-time federal careers. But this is really at a small scale. But when the government comes in and provides these scholarships, it keeps a cybersecurity program at a number of universities healthy. So if we can expand this program, I think it not only gives you more federal employees to pick from with the right type of education, and this isn't just bachelor's, it's about associate degrees as well, it's about graduate degrees. But if we make these departments healthy for the federal government, they'll be healthy for the private sector as well. There'll be a lot more students in there than are just in this CyberCore program. So I think thinking about how we scale that, how we identify the universities, how we make the associate's degrees the right level for the right jobs is something that we could really work on. So those are two of the initiatives that I think we think about pretty consistently across the commission.
That's incredibly important, and I'd add, the same issues with changing technology, with the, growth in artificial intelligence. Quantum will mean that today's cybersecurity jobs look very different 5 years, 10 years, 15 years down the road. So I think that's even more important to get ahead of it, such that we can begin to think about what that educational programming could look like. So I'm really glad to hear that that's a focus. I'm interested in the landscape, too, between the 3 different, sort of commissions here. Is there anything missing from this landscape? What else could have been covered in the space? Are there still big holes in the cybersecurity ecosystem, or are we out of commissions for the time being?
Well, I think two of these commissions are ongoing. The third is there and valuable, and we referred to it when we did our work. So I don't think there's an issue of are there too many or too few. I think they're all different, and they all have different perspectives. So you mentioned quantum computing, and then the corollary is quantum-resistant encryption, right? So one of the things you have to do when you go out 10 years as opposed to 1 year is you're well into the quantum world. And so you have to start planning now for how do you defend not only the new software and the new data that will come online, but what do you do about all the data that is encrypted today in a form that isn't going to survive general purpose quantum? So while I think that you can always have more or less commissions, I think there's really a pretty strong agreement on what has to be done. I really applaud Solarium because it is an organization that has both administration and it has Congress working together. And I think ultimately that's going to be necessary to move this forward.
Fantastic. Any other thoughts on holes in the ecosystem? Is cyberspace the right frame from which we should be taking this?
Well, I'd say there's another commission, not here, but very closely related, the Artificial Intelligence Commission, co-chaired by Eric Schmidt and Bob Work, I think is working in an area that is right in between what Peter was mentioning and what we're doing. So I think there's if I could channel my old boss, Senator McCain, there's probably too many commissions. But in the context of if it gets the right people talking about the right ideas, it's useful. And I'll double down that we fully plan on plagiarizing both Kiersten and the Moonshot initiatives within our commission, because when it's a good idea, you need to keep saying it until action's taken. So do I think there'll be a further commission? Certainly. Do I think that there'll be things that we recommended that don't get done and therefore can be rolled in that commission? Unfortunately, certainly as well.
That makes a lot of sense. It looks like we're going to have a couple minutes for questions, so I do want to get the audience starting thinking about their questions, but I do want to ask one more question of the panel first, take the moderator's privilege. What advice would you give to the folks in the audience, to fellows like ours, to others who are thinking about getting involved in this space? How do you make your interventions practical? What do you think about when you're building in order to make sure that the things that you build have impact? And what advice would you share with those trying to do so in the future?
So I think it goes into something that both Peter and Mark have said, which is you have to have the big idea. And I do think the interesting piece to what the Moonshot has done is looking to 2028. It does allow you to have that big idea. But what the Moonshot has done extremely well is then say, okay, you've got the big idea. What are the pieces that are going to actually get you to that big idea? And making sure that what you create is actionable and making sure that it can be executed, but always pushing yourself. I think to Mark's point and to your earlier question, Betsy, around where the future is, as we look at deep learning, as we look at artificial intelligence, the ethics component of that is going to be very important. So we we innovate, but we don't want to innovate at the cost of both security and ethics. And so thinking through these elements that are sort of foundational human principles becomes very important. The other piece is we talk a lot about resilience, and how we define resilience is interesting, because I think when we tend to look at resilience, we mean it to be building something or keeping something the way that it was before something happened, or ensuring that you're not disrupted. And I'll make the physical disaster analogy, which is, post-hurricane, we take a lot of pride in building our communities to what they were before the disaster happened. But the Dutch have a very interesting model, and you see it, which is you don't build to what you had, you build to what you see in the future. And I think when we look at what's actionable and we look at these recommendations and what we're looking to build, we always want to have in our mind not just restoring what was, but really anticipating what the future environment's going to be, to Peter's point, and where the threats are going to evolve. We're not going to know everything. That's part of the challenge and the excitement of this space. But you do have to look to the future so that we are constantly evolving our own models and our own infrastructure.
Fantastic. Other practical advice?
Well, if I were to give advice to people in the audience or watching this, I would say be inclusive. And I actually think that today was a great example of that. You had senior members from the Department of Justice, from CISA, from private companies, from academia, from the media, and every one of them was reaching out and saying we can work together. And I think that that inclusiveness doesn't always come naturally. When we were working on our initial report and set up the 6 pillars, one of those pillars was privacy. And privacy is absolutely integral to what we need to do. And we knew it and we recognized it. But I will say, at least initially, we struggled getting NGO organizations that are privacy focused to actually work with us. Because it was, oh, you guys come from the government, or you're a presidential commission. Why, you're not really interested in privacy, we're kind of a stalking horse. And the answer was, no, we really are. And we ultimately overcame that. And we ultimately had really good impact and really good feedback from folks who make a living, protecting people's privacy. But it had to be overcome. And so my advice would be, lower the skepticism a little bit. And when people from all of these areas say they want to help, take their word for it, because they probably do.
Fantastic. Any final?
No, I think they hit it both fine.
Perfect. Well, that means we have time for a question or two. Yes, we have one right in the center.
Thanks. Morgan Bachman at Cybersecurity. Just a simple follow-up question for Mr. Altabef. You mentioned that the moonshot recommendations haven't been officially approved, but that CISA is helping with the implementation of parts of it, or parts of those recommendations. Can you just expand a little bit about what you're talking about there?
Well, one of the items that we heard earlier from CISA is their work in education, right? They're actively reaching out to state and local governments. They're actively reaching out to companies, and they're actually putting in a protocol to help these organizations defend themselves. So that idea of a protocol to educate, to defend oneself is a really important thing, because although the technologies will change, the idea of setting up a cybersecurity hygiene protocol for state and local governments, for companies, for private individuals is really important. And I think CISA is doing a terrific job in that, just as one example.
Fantastic. Well, we're almost out of time, but I do want to conclude by quickly asking you to each give a bumper sticker. What's the one thing you want the audience to remember about your initiative? Mark, they're pointing to you.
Well, we'll see. Keep your eye on the report in April and see how much of the report translates into law over the next 6 months after that. And that'll be the first measure of success. There'll be others, but that'll be the first measure of success.
Fantastic. Kiersten?
Cybersecurity is not political. There's industry and government collaboration, and log on to the Cyber Readiness Institute and look at the free tools for small businesses to help secure your supply chain.
I did not tell them this question was coming, by the way, but it sure sounds like you were ready for it. Peter, last word.
Don't wait for the Sputnik moment to happen to us to get started.
Fantastic way on which to end. Thank you so much to the panel for joining us.